background for me, it looks like this is the IT track room. Was not aware that that's how this was being promoted. So contrary to perhaps expectation, I myself don't have a background in computer science, per se. I went to college at a time when economics was still the most popular major on campus. I understand the landscape has changed it a bit. Computer science does, in many campuses, hold that title. But at the time, that's where my interests were. I also had interests in learning foreign languages. And so I actually majored in international economics. Moved out to DC after I graduated, took a job subsequently in India, working for an outfit based out of the MIT Department of Economics. I was doing some research with Nobel-winning economist Esther Duflo, doing randomized control trials and field experiments for various policy reforms in that country. And then I came back to stateside, to the US for grad school during a time when the country was still coming out of the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. I became very interested in the policy response to that, and then shortly after graduating from graduate school, came to New York and made a living developing econometric stress test models as part of the annual CCAR submissions in a period where the Dodd-Frank legislation was just becoming enforceable law, and there was a lot of business in that area. So kind of honed my modeling skills. At that point, really modeling was very separate from sort of the IT world. There was, we had in economics field a whole kind of separate set of statistical programming languages that you use. Stata was a big thing then, and to a lesser extent R. And then the opportunity came up with Moody's, and that was about 7 years ago. And so I took the role and really coincided almost perfectly with Moody's investment in Domino. And so Domino really has unleashed a lot of efficiencies and innovation with us since then. So my first sort of endeavor that I undertook with Domino coincided with an initiative that our team at Moody's was starting, a sort of standardization initiative. And I don't know if anyone here in sort of the IT space is familiar with the term sort of knowledge management or that sort of practice. It's a thing in professional services. If you're in this room and you have been involved, you probably wouldn't want to admit it because it's often a very heavy-handed process. The way IP generally gets transmitted throughout an organization is through organic, informal networks. And occasionally management will have the idea that we need to centralize this sort of transmission of skills and knowledge. And often that means there's sort of a command and control process set in place where consultants might go to a central manager to check out the latest artifact, and when they make updates to that, then they have to go back and return it to that central location. And if they want to ever check out something else, they have to make sure that there's this sort of quid pro quo in place. So we thought, let's try to do this differently. That's a process that typically dies under its own weight. It creates more work for everyone. Let's see if we can create a standardization process that actually creates less work for everyone. And the way that we came up with how to do that was by using Domino to actually automate those processes. So take everything that's in an individual artifact saved on an individual local computer and put that in an app that you would host in an app center like Domino that anyone can access and generate those results at a push of a button. And we came to the realization, and it's a principle I think applies in a lot of other contexts as well, that when you make things easier for people in this context, people will enforce that standardization on their own. And so it makes everything more efficient, and Domino is a big part of that.
It's the power of automation.
That's right.
Just work in Domino and it stays there, so in good. For those less familiar with Moody's in 2024, can you just tell us a little bit background about the company?
Sure. Right, so Moody's is traditionally known as a credit ratings agency. It had been the core part of our business going back over 100 years. In the early part of this century, Moody's started making more investments in quantitative modeling, software, technology. They started the Moody's Analytics business as sort of a separate business, and that had been the fastest growing portion of the business. And it now actually represents more than 50% of the revenue. So we've rebranded, and it's getting a lot more attention from investors and everyone in this community. So that's the side of Moody's that I've been on, and it's the side that we'll be talking about today.
Thank you. We are here to understand how Moody's delivers an AI product or service at scale.
Yep.
Doing a one-off is relatively doable, but doing it for multiple customers, scaling it across multiple customers securely. We will hear later from Finra on how they do that at a big scale as well. Can you share with us how do you make an AI product, or how do you create a move from a model into a product and a service?
Yeah. So we have this nice slide here prepared. It's actually an image taken from our annual report, which depicts visually how we integrate all these different streams of Moody's Analytics intellectual property. And so where my team operates is here at the central node. So what we'll do is we'll feed in here, you see on the right side, the research and insights from teams like Mark Zandi's economics team that are producing economic forecasts and other macroeconomic research. Credit risk models produce our PDs and LGD estimates for the commercial lending space and other research. Then here on this side, the data information segment of the business. Products.
This is more internal stuff. That's more from people you work with, from your customers.
So in terms of who consumes this,
yeah.
Fair question. Both internal and external. We have numerous customers that will buy our models, buy our research, our analytics, our forecasts, and use that for their own purposes. Where my team comes in, typically we will consume this, and we'll get to this and create our own decision solution. So it gets utilized internally. There's more value that's added to it before it's eventually passed on to the customer. On this side, you have our proprietary data, so large industry databases with both financials for public and private corporations, banks, products like Orbis, Bank Focus, and then other proprietary data from our clients where they have specific data for perhaps non-public borrowers, if there are banks, where they would use a product like Credit Lens, one of our main flagship products, to spread that data. And so there's all this kind of data research coming together here in a sort of customer-centric decision solution. So my team is often involved in developing that solution. So what that generally means is we set up workshops with clients to better understand their portfolio, understand the drivers of risk in their portfolio, what impacts the creditworthiness of their typical borrowers, and come up with a list of factors, factor responses, scores, and rates to come up with the sort of agency-style qualitative overlay that would put on top of the models and the data and add predictive power, discriminatory power to the model. Generally, expert judgment plus model outperforms model by itself, but then also be pretty instrumental in take-up and adoption. We operate under the principle that our clients will be much more likely to internalize and institutionalize the systems they purchase from us if they themselves believe they were part in designing and developing those solutions. So there's a big human part of that as well that we deal with, and obviously the undertaking involves cloud hosting of typically an interface that will pull all these things together, and API connections to all the various different data and research, and a machine learning and or Gen AI piece to sort of automate the reporting, the artifacts that come out of that tool.
That's really cool. Just to take one step back, to level set, you take data from Moody's, you take the data that the customer provided you, and also additional proprietary industry data and data sources to provide them with the decisioning services.
Yep.
That's cool. It sounds like you work with large amounts of data. In this world, in 2024, that's a great situation for Gen AI. It's the ability to consume a lot of data, consume a lot of information, come up with what you heard, the chat bots, the question answer services. Can you describe for Moody's the interplay between data and AI and how you bring them together into these products, where you leverage a traditional AI, the machine learning, and how you get Gen AI in the picture to take advantage of those powers?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the AI piece, I'll say we use Domino for that whole kind of value chain, for everything from the development, the co-development. We use Domino to automate the GitHub operations that allow us to fork and push updates from dev to prod, et cetera. We use Domino for the job scheduling, to update the data on a periodic basis, to host these applications, our shiny application, Python Dash applications that we use to provide an interface for this, and then ultimately to automate the artifacts and reports. And so AI typically in the recent past where we've been utilizing it has come in sort of that later phase where we're sort of automating the narrative that we would generate to kind of memorialize all of that analysis in a final report. There's Moody's had a lot of success doing things like this, taking large amounts of unstructured data, putting it with a credit memo or a model risk management report that they would use to provide to regulators to show that they're managing their model risk. So there's a lot of different applications that we've had success with, but there's still challenges that remain. And one of the key challenges that's specific to sort of my team and the way where we operate in this whole picture is as it relates to the data that we need to use to apply this expert judgment overlay, right? So first of all, as we all know, as you might expect, Moody's as a company that operates primarily in the financial industry, we deal with numeric data, and we're all too familiar with the limitations that large language models have in computing, even simple grade level arithmetic. So there's that one challenge. Then there's sort of the other difference, one of the other key differences, I should say, between the data we use and the data that large language models are trained on is of course, many large language models are trained on unstructured data, and they're designed to be able to parse that. And so we're very familiar with the column structures and the table structures, and so we're not necessarily relying on AI for as much as it could, for all the value that it could potentially present.
It's actually easy to analyze instead of having to rely on the tool.
Yeah, so, and then there's, in addition to that, whether or not the data is numeric, non-numeric, structured, or unstructured, there's certain cases where the data just doesn't exist at all other than in the client's head, right? So when it comes to this sort of expert judgment, the client, you're dealing with clients that have been in the industry for decades and are on first-name bases with their borrowers, and they have ways that not maybe everyone from the outside understands in assessing kind of fully rounding out the credit risk profile of their borrowers. And we essentially ultimately rely on the customer to provide that data for us. So that's kind of the next challenge for us, to figure out if there's a way to perhaps use AI to be able to use that data and perhaps a predictive AI-based engine to replicate the kind of expert judgment that you might be able to get from a loan officer who's been working in the industry for decades and knows all his clients on a first-name basis, his or her clients.
That's a fascinating situation because it's a unquantifiable data almost. So is it touching a little bit on the gut feeling, or do they have additional resources that are less traditional that they can share with you?
Yeah, so they're typically factors that you might see in like a consulting case interview. So management quality, competitive landscape, diversification of the supplier base. So they are quantifiable. There's research out there that produces scales and things like that to measure things like this that are difficult to quantify but can be can be combined in some sort of ordinal measure. But it's not nearly as structured as perhaps some of the financial data that is traditionally used to assess credit risk, your financial statement, income statement, balance sheet type of data. So it's a new horizon for us, and it's one that I think AI will be instrumental in helping us pursue.
So digging deeper a little bit into the world of Gen AI, how does Moody's ensure the accuracy and integrity of generative outputs, what the models bring out? And you mentioned humans and experts. How do you involve them in the loop there for verifying that what you're delivering is actually correct?
It's a great question, and it's certainly not one that Moody's is uniquely grappling with. And so I think when you talk about verifying the accuracy and integrity of your data, setting aside sort of ethical questions, that's a whole nother topic, but just strictly in terms of the accuracy, I think it's a matter of balancing sort of the moonshot approach versus the achievable contained solution, the sort of fully flexible, universally applicable approach versus the sort of standard and more curated approach. And as I mentioned, Moody's is involved in applying Gen AI technology in many different applications across the financial space. You can see lending, portfolio management, investment analysis, KYC, climate. I tend to operate right here, as you probably already assumed, in sort of the lending space. But I've had sort of a window into how we apply this in a lot of different contexts that are listed there. And I think it really depends, which path you take really depends on the context of the project. So, and it often comes down to resourcing, right? For resource-constrained teams, it's often wise to sort of rein in, sort of take the reins in a little bit on a large language model. And I've seen cases where you'll sort of producing a model risk management report or the type of artifact that comes out of this decision engine, you'll really want to make sure it's human curated versus AI curated. Now, you can fix the sort of sequence and ordering of all the visual assets, graphs, charts, tables, and then ask the large language model to provide the summary narrative in and around that, fill it in. And I've seen success with that, with relatively small resource-constrained teams being able to utilize large language models for that purpose. The key there is you're not overwhelming yourself because you're always juxtaposing the visual and the language output. So there's never any question where that AI-generated response came from. It's always essentially linked to its source in the actual report that's generated. So that's one approach you could take. I've seen other approaches where larger teams have said, we're going to give it a little more leash and let AI curate the flow and the sequencing of the presentation. And there are pros and cons to each, right? On the one hand, with the more structured approach, we've had clients say, look, we're a heavily regulated financial institution, financial intermediary. Every time we run this report on a quarterly, monthly, weekly basis, whatever the case may be, we need to see this indicator, or this set of indicators, in this format, in this exact same place in the report, to be able to track it. And we want to know what the number is, even if there's absolutely no change and there's nothing interesting to report. In fact, if there's no change, it's just as important as if there was some big spike, right? AI, in my experience, I've heard it described as sort of your overly confident teenager or your overeager undergrad looking to impress their professor, just straining to find some insight where none exists. And so you do get challenges there where take the sort of achievable solution approach. You get the standardization, you get results that are easier to track reporting period to reporting period, but you may miss something because you're sort of laser focused on specific things, and you're not capturing necessarily the full value that these large language models present. But on the other end, if you're taking the moonshot approach, you're going to capture more value, but it's a bigger leap. You're going to also expose yourself to more risk. So that's where really it becomes very important to make sure that all of the claims you're making that are AI generated are labeled as such, and are, that you're always including a citation to those claims, so that the user can ideally quickly trace back that claim to its source. And we found that in those cases, clients simply, it's almost a non-starter. If they can't do that, right? If they're relying on an AI-assisted tool to generate a credit memo, which gets put in a portfolio of other required documents to be able to approve, a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, and they can't check to make sure all those claims are actually correct and there's no hallucinations, there's absolutely no market. So they're not going to pay $1 for it. It's an absolute necessity. We've had to build into our tool. And now as there are advances in AI models, it's almost, every week or seemingly almost every day that there's a new model released out there. We've spoken to LLM vendors that have actually built products that include this type of referencing or citation capability natively within the model. So we're getting to the point where we're seeing big improvements, even in the few months that we've been working on this type of initiative. Yeah.
So two things. One, it's great to know, and it's something that's unique to the financial services industry and other regulated industries, that there is a level of skepticism that's built into the customer behavior already. So if they know to look for the citations, they know to not have any blind faith in machines before humans look at the outputs in that case. Just to follow up on what you said with regards to the small team versus large team, are you concerned that the small team will simply offload more work to an LLM, whereas a large team will have more of an ability to monitor and track their performance? What's the balance there?
Yeah, I think RAG might be a solution to that, where you think there is a possibility that a smaller, more under-resourced team might be inclined to rely more, actually give kind of more leash to the model. And I think that's where it becomes, you have to be careful when you're drawing from the entire internet worth of data. John Thompson upstairs had mentioned a lot of the work that essentially EY has done in creating kind of ring-fenced, gate-kept environments for their employees to use large language models for various different applications. Moody's has similar systems in place and has a tool in place accessible to anyone within the company, 14,000 plus employees, to go in and essentially create a RAG-based query so it's not just accessing, a large language model off the shelf. Mm-hmm. It's actually a sort of a more customized, so to speak, version of that model through a RAG-based entitlement. So
and you give it the more contextual information.
And you can give it more contextual information. So certainly we expect that what you mentioned may happen, but we can mitigate that risk by helping make sure that the output we receive is pulling from source material that is more appropriate for the context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Once you have your trained models, your analysts are happy, you have the data working. How do you maintain them? How do you keep them fresh in the long term?
It's a good question. And it touches on something that I mentioned a little bit earlier when it comes to the data sources. Mm-hmm. So the models and scorecards that we use, to the extent they're drawing heavily on industry data sources and models that have been published and made available internally and are actively maintained, that process is easier. We use Domino jobs Sen here in the audience from our team can speak extensively to that for the process of automating the periodic update of the data, running them through the models, potentially retraining the model, assessing the performance. Domino has a great built-in model lifecycle management platform, which you can program to produce all of these sort of performance metrics for your various inventory of models. And so that's all well and good when your data is highly curated and it's quantitative and structured. It's where you get into this sort of unstructured data source area where it might be non-financial in nature, it might be unstructured, and we might, as a company, Moody's, not have that, may not control the process for obtaining and updating that data. That's where it gets a little bit trickier.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to think of this as a challenge that really presents the opportunity to update our process and, again, potentially find a way to use AI to replicate the expert judgment. Because while when we collect this data in our surveys for this expert judgment overlay, we're not looking over the shoulders of every individual loan officer. They're getting the information from somewhere. I'm pretty sure it's, they're not just sort of reading the tea leaves and scoring their portfolio with whatever those really opaque manners. They're getting information from somewhere. So now, as the speaker previously mentioned, with large language models, we're no longer sort of having to limit our data science to 10% of the available data. It's really expanded dramatically the types of data that you can use in predictive, causal, and generative AI. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm very excited about the possibilities that presents for us to update our process and help our customers use all the data that's available to us, all these tools you see here, to better navigate their credit risk.
And that even gives you the opportunity to look over the shoulders of those loan officers and generally see if they did their job.
Yeah, look over their shoulders, but not clone their voices.
Yes, for now. So you have a customer-centric model. It's ready for them to access it. How do you make it available to them? You mentioned you're using applications, but how do you share it with them? How do you control access? How do you know who are the right people getting to the models?
Yeah, that's a great question. We work with our sort of internal Domino team, of which Sen here is the leader. We have an app center that we use to register and publish models to make them available on a user and consumer basis. That's one of the many Domino innovations that we've leveraged pretty heavily. So we have an easy way of sort of gatekeeping who on our team has developer or collaborator level permissions, who can actually go and edit the source code, and who on the team is a sort of a results consumer that can go in and review or make a copy of the source code and not actually edit the active version, and who may only need or want to view the user interface and access the application as a pure kind of consumer. And for that case, yeah, we use the project workspace for the collaboration. We use the App Center for sort of the productionalizing of these applications.
Love that.
Yeah.
We're almost at time. Last question. What advice would you give to aspiring data scientists who want to enter the financial services industry and explore the very deep world of credit rating?
Sure, I'd say maybe two things. I would say programming is still a skill, and learning languages is also still a skill. A little while back when I was putting together sort of a roadmap for the next generation of kind of client-facing apps, I mentioned I'd initially started out building mostly internal productivity enhancers, right? I think maybe one thing that distinguishes this panel here is what we're talking about now is moving into a space where it's, from Domino's perspective, it's not just B2B, it's B2B to C, right? And so we're now developing applications that are directly client-facing. And so there's an additional layer or added measure of production and industry standard sort of performance that you need there. And so there was a discussion, well, okay, we need to get resources with experience in development. And there was an initial thought when AI first became a corporate mandate a little over a year ago that, oh, well, we don't need to hire experienced engineers. We have AI. And I've had experiences over the past year that suggest programming is absolutely still a very relevant skill. Large language models cannot, in my experience, yet take a piece of complex code out of context and troubleshoot it for you. There is still a very important need to be able to take a large segment of complex code, distill it down to its essential elements into a sort of generalizable example, and then use that to solicit your sort of troubleshooting advice, whether from a human being or from a machine. But it's still a very important skill that I would also liken to, as I mentioned, the art of language learning. I've had a lifelong love of languages, both human and computer, spoken or expressed through a musical instrument, whatever the case may be. And I think that has served me well in developing programming skills to be able to put together applications like these that we've mentioned throughout my career, and as we now venture into this new territory of exploring the applications of AI, and I think it'll continue to do so beyond.
Awesome. Turning to the audience, any questions for Logan? Go ahead.
Thank you. Linda Avery mentioned how invasive the potential introduction of some of these tools and processes into organizations are. I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on your point about data that resides in people's heads. In a sense, you come into an organization as an external party.
Mm-hmm.
Do you encounter sometimes an adversarial mode or some kind of a suspicion as to what the role is coming in, and how do you resolve that conflict?
It's a great question, and I think it's on the surface somewhat unsatisfying that so many of these conversations when it comes to AI come down to, well, we still need to better understand human beings, right? Human beings are extremely complex and they face a lot of different incentives and motivations, and I think part of the process of successfully implementing one of these solutions we described that Moody's deploys to our clients and helping them navigate credit risk is first doing a sort of stakeholder analysis and trying to understand really who are all the individuals, internal and external, that can be impacted or will impact the outcome of this project, and trying to identify what the potential opposition might be, whether actively or passively expressed, because they're both equally, they can both equally negatively affect the outcome of your project. You may just have individuals that may not express that opposition outright, but that's certainly a reality. If you haven't identified who those individuals might be, you probably just haven't thought hard enough. Because that's almost an inevitability that there will be people sort of tied to the status quo, and the messaging really depends on, again, kind of where they sit within the organization. So, if you're dealing with a individual in a kind of heading up the credit ratings team who has a certain headcount they're trying to preserve or even grow, and you have a solution that proposes to automate some of that process, you can expect what the opposition might be. But there may be others in the organization who are responsible for reporting the net interest margin and the expense ratio of the bank to outside investors who may have different incentives, who might be more favorable toward your solution. So you really have to kind of take a holistic look at who the stakeholders are, tailor your messaging accordingly, find a champion early on within the group that can help promote the solution, and go from there. I mean, I think I would turn the tables and look at my own experience. There were people within Moody's who looked skeptical when we first made our investment with Domino. But I was one of the people who saw this as an opportunity. I've been a champion, big champion of Domino's, really ever since our investment. And Ryan Piacenti, who's, I don't even know if he's here, he was our CSM from day one, and was very savvy in sort of identifying me as someone who would really be an early adopter of the solution and help sort of evangelize it throughout the rest of the team. And I think it's been a success for Domino and a success for us.
That's great. Any other questions?
As you go forward to try and defend the value kind of at the board level for finance approval, what about the platform was kind of central to that? Was it efficiency? Was it regulatory? Any way to quantify that?
Right. So I started out with a story of how we internally first started using Domino to sort of standardize and automate a lot of our IP, sort of migrating that from Excel files that were sort of hosted on people's local computers onto something centrally hosted. You'd be surprised even today how many large institutions are still so heavily reliant on Excel files that are saved, who knows where, the best SharePoint sometimes, on individual computers. So it is very much a efficiency story. It's also a security story. There are manifold benefits. And yeah, we're finding out more and more that we almost can't sell our advisory solutions, right? I come from a shop that is traditionally, thought of as the consulting shop within Moody's, a bunch, consultants, and we traffic in Microsoft Office deliverables, PowerPoint slides, Excel file appendices. And it's getting to the point where we can't really sell our IP without being able to package it with a user interface that uses API to connect all the dots seamlessly in the back end for the efficiency gains and the security gains, among others.
Thank you. Anything else? We're absolutely on time, so to the minute. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Logan. Much
Thanks so much,
appreciated.
Yuval.
Thank you. Thank you.